Thank you. All right, the time is 3:30. We'll call our meeting to order. Host McClure,
Chair Staff,
here.
Member Ben Willis. Here. Member Okrepke.
Here.
Let the order reflect that all subcommittee members are present.
Wonderful. And with that, we can open up to public comments to item not on the agenda. Are there any members of the public here? Seeing none, we'll move on to item 3, approval of minutes. Is there any edits or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, I think we can approve the minutes as submitted. I like the pace we're going through this. We'll move on to item 4.1, our financial policies. Alan, where's yours?
All right. So, all right. So if you remember way back long ago to goal setting, as part of Greg Devereaux's presentation, it's been a long day. I'm just trying to be a little.
It does seem like a long time ago. I grant you that.
Yes. He showed a number of financial policies that the city should look at and move forward with trying to adopt, and that I think will become part of my work plan going forward. So what I wanted to do with this presentation is just take you at a very high level of where we are, what policies I think we could bring forward, give you just a kind of outline of what they would look like, and then talk about next steps, which would most likely be, depending on the feedback from the subcommittee, would be to come back with all or some of those policies. We'll draft out what they'll be. Then ultimately they would go to the city council for approval. So financial policies, thank you. Financial policies are central to a strategic and long-term approach to our financial management. So as I said, Greg put up a number of policies on his slide. GFOA has about, 15 slides or 15 policies. They determine our best practices. The nice thing is that we actually have most of those in place. Some of the big ones are, we have a policy around our general fund reserves. We have reserve policies for actually all of our funds, other than special revenue. We have a debt management policy. With disclosures, we have an investment policy. We have grant administration. Our charter requires an audit. We have policies relative to certain internal controls that are in there, so especially anything dealing with cash. So from that standpoint, we're in very good shape from that. We've past finance departments have been good at making sure that we have a well-structured and documented way to deal with our funds. Next slide, please. And the reason why they do that is that because we want to institutionalize good financial management practices and have things that live longer than the present moment. So we put things in writing and they exist long after me and after councils, and it just sets up the city going forward. It defines the limits of the actions the staff may take, providing boundaries within which staff can innovate, but still realize the organization's strategic intent. It is excellent for supporting good bond ratings and lowering the cost of borrowing, and it manages risks to the condition of the city. So again, I looked through, and like I said, we have GFOA has about 15 policies that were best practices. There are 4 that we don't have, and those are about the only 4 on that list that we don't have here. So, and these are things that we actually do. We just don't have them written in policy. So, and I guess I should take a step back. We strive to do these. But putting them in actually in writing is something that we could talk about doing. So a structurally balanced budget would be one of them. Long-term financial planning. I mean, we actually have a subcommittee where we talk about that, but this is something that we don't have a policy that is established around that. We could do one relative to capital projects and one for the use of our reserves. We have a practice in that our fiscal stability reserves were defined under a practice, and we have that right now where you can only use those for certain things having to do with trying to balance out financial problems within the general fund, but we don't have that actually written as a policy going forward. So next slide, please. So a structurally balanced budget, what this policy would do would be, it would offer a distinction between how you would statutorily define a balanced budget and actually achieving a true structurally balanced budget where ongoing expenses match ongoing revenues. We would define the use of one-time funds so they're not used for ongoing operational costs or programs. We could talk about our reserves and how they should not be used for solving structural deficits, use them instead for the catastrophic events that may happen. That's what we would typically want to use those for, but we would actually put that in writing for that. We could also look at, again, I'm taking this at a very high level. I can go back to slides later when we get to the discussion point to have more of that, unless you want to take each one and kind of pick them apart.
I'll defer to my colleagues. Any questions at the moment? I would go ahead. No, go for it.
Just a quick one.
Sure.
So just so I'm understanding, so when you went over the financial policy overview, the first part, those are policies that we have in place?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So today you're talking about the things that we could put in place.
Yeah.
The structural balance budget, et cetera. Okay,
Right.
just
Yeah.
wanted to be clear. Thank you. That's all.
Again, things that we try to do, but we don't actually have in writing, so this would be actually memorializing these practices. Next slide would be looking at establishing a policy to commit the city to take a long-term approach to financial health. It's established practice in the city, but this would more formalize the process, looking at multi-year forecasting for the operations in the general fund, which we do. And you'll hear about that again in the next presentation. We could look at and really what we would do is formalize our forecasting part of it. That would be the basis of this type of a policy. And lay out when we are presenting it to this committee, when we're presenting it to the council going forward. So that will just be practice from here on out. I would say of all four, this is the easiest one. You want to pick some low hanging fruit. This is one that I could give you tomorrow. Capital projects is this is something that I think is very important as we go through our capital planning. But this policy would cover the life cycle of capital assets, including capital improvement planning, capital budgeting, project management, and asset management. It would ensure, or could, excuse me, ensure that the city allocates capital funding resources effectively, maintaining public infrastructure and in the most cost-effective manner, having complete, reliable, and attainable scope and cost estimates for capital budgeting, planning for staffing, operation, and maintenance costs that go along with a particular capital asset, and really looking at only budgeting those projects when there are reasonable expectations that the resources would be available to pay for them. So some of this are things that we're already doing now in our CIP. Dan Hennessy has done a great job of looking at the current CIP portfolio and really taking this lens toward that. What can we actually do? What's going to be the ongoing cost for that? And with the ability to move projects forward, but and be transparent with all of the costs that go with those projects. And finally, we could create a policy expanding really our policy, our current general fund reserve policy, but expand it to include things like the fiscal stability reserves and the use of reserves when we have a significant amount over our mandated amounts. So basically anything above what we would call our available reserves. So anything above our 17% line in the sand that we don't go below. How to spend those, how would you want to spend those? I still have scars from the last time we tried to go through that, and the ever increasing number of buckets that we could put money into, because we have a lot of needs in the city, and to be able to store money away to be able to hit those is a very difficult thing. We were, when we received the PG&E money and established those stability reserves, the finance subcommittee at that time they finally had the funds to be able to do something with it, and they knew that we were going to go through some difficult budget times, so they wanted to put money aside early to try to address that. And we're very happy that they were that prescient. But those are things that we could go and do. I mean, I could give you the pros and cons of a lot of these. These do tend to, at least some of them, something like this, it can be seen to tie hands of how funds will be spent, and that takes a lot of thought of how you want to do that. Should those, but I do think that it is a strong financial course to do these. GFOA agrees. A lot of the examples for those four that I talked about actually pulled from other budgets, specifically the county of San Bernardino. That was one that was Greg pointed me to that, and so I went through there, and they actually had all those. But I would also caution you, the county of San Bernardino went through a very difficult period, and so coming out of that, they established all of these. So there's a rhyme and a reason for it, and there you go. So that's at a very high level. I would suggest that if any of those, I think the first way we might want to look at it is, do those four or any of those four make sense that you would want us to go in and then craft a policy around it? Then we would come back to this body and outline exactly what that policy is going to do. And then you could, at that point, let us know that you would either want that advanced to the full council, either in study session or directly to a report item, or not. And then it would end there. And I would try with a new committee in a couple of years.
Wait for this crew to rotate out. No, that's good.
Sometimes that's what we do. How long did it take us to get a 115 trust through?
We're very happy to have it.
Many years.
And well, you're right to think that the prescience of both you guys and former councils for having the reserves above and beyond the required minimums. I mean, thank heavens, otherwise we'd be having even more unpleasant meetings right now. Did any other parts to that excellent presentation? Are we ready for the questions?
No, I tried to keep it very, very short. I actually thought this one was gonna go second. And so you were gonna be so beat up by the first one that this would be a breath of fresh air for you.
Oh, that would have been a good strategic move, maybe. It would
So-
be easier to get this one across the line.
Yeah.
Well, here,
So now when Veronica talks, you can go and say, oh, hey, Alan's got some things that might help us.
well, let me turn to my colleague for questions here. Anything from either of you? Before, I'll go second.
Oh, okay, just to really, was wondering about that fiscal stability reserve. What would that look like? Is that separate from because it says expand, what does that mean?
Right. So right now, we do have what we call a fiscal stability reserve. I think Scott uses a different terminology for it, but I think that's how we first came across it. And it was specifically set up and assigned for use to help us. Should we have a deficit, we use those funds to plug that gap.
So it's set aside.
It is,
Okay.
it's set aside within our reserves, so it is an amount that's there that we can point to, and we know how much is in it.
Mhm.
We know how quick it's going away, and but it's there. It's accounted for in that group, and it cannot be used for any other purpose,
Okay.
which is the beauty of it, because it really protected it to be used for times like we're in right now.
So we have one already, maybe called something else.
We just
but
don't.
We just want to expand
Right,
it.
what we don't have, and what I'm suggesting that we could do going forward, even if the fiscal stability reserves don't exist anymore, a policy for creating something like that, where we could say, you know what, that was a really good idea. And should we be in a point to where to where our reserves get flush again, and we have the funds, we should put it aside for just this type of use and actually have that spelled out. So in 10 years from now, let's say that we get flush again and we have money, Scott or somebody else, because I'll be long gone by that point, can pick up a policy and say, hey, per policy, we've created this fund for you. And you could, we could call it whatever. It's just I use the terminology that we have, but it's that basic idea of saying, okay, if we're over our mandated reserve amounts, and we want to make sure that we're using monies for purposes that are going to be fiscally sound going forward. And that's what you mean.
Thank you.
Sure. Through the chair, Scott Wagner, Deputy Director of Finance, I think is worth belaboring in this. Just member Ben Wells, I want to just briefly summarize the types of reserves we do have, because I think it's worth just summarizing. I say we have 3 reserves at the city right now. We've traditionally had 2.
Okay.
The first being our mandated reserve, which we would characterize as that's really our baseline of reserves. That's what Alan said. That's the line we don't want to cross. That's the amount that we really know through disasters or economic recessions that we need kind of set aside so that we can continue operations in either of those situations. That's about 17% of our annual expenditures. The second traditional bucket that the city's had, we call available reserves. That's really just anything above that. The city's always operated that way, and the terminology that I don't use is calling that extra, which is the simple way to put it. Because in reality, that second bucket is strained beyond belief for all the things that we don't budget for, whether that's facility needs or long-term replacements, capital, big projects, et cetera. What Alan spoke to is that, again, wisely through a former council, they decided to set up a third informal reserve that was not contained within the reserve policy of a fiscal stability reserve. As Alan mentioned, there was a specific term of use for that, really to cover budget deficits, which we now have done 3 years in a row. So that's going down. This really gives us an opportunity again. I think what Alan said well is that the time to think about those cycles is when you're coming in and out of them versus all of a sudden having a large influx of available reserves. I hope that's helpful.
No, that is. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, my only question is on the capital projects part. In theory, I love it, but the plan for funding projected staffing operations, I mean, we get engineering estimates all the time that are nowhere near the bids we get to actually do it. So it's great in theory, but the feasibility of it,
Well,
how can we be accurate on that?
you
You take a stab.
yeah, you probably have a less snarky one than I have.
Let's find out. So Member O'Keefe, thank you for that question. I think as Alan mentioned, there's some here that are easier lifts and some are heavier. Capital's gonna be one of the heavy ones. And I think I can restate your question maybe in 2 separate ways. Certainly, as far as the capital cost of the project to actually put sticks up and build something. Yes, oftentimes on a cost basis, we end up going over that. That's one aspect of this. Where the policy is really trying to address though, is once we build something, can we actually afford to do anything with it? The city has been challenged in the past to do so through prior facilities. We have a great idea to build X, but where are we getting the employees to run it? Where are we getting the cost to maintain it? How are we paying for the utilities to run it? And I think where agencies have failed prior is that they put all that effort into building it and getting the funding to build it. Now what? Especially in a situation where we have a deficit. Is that
Yeah.
helpful?
Yeah, it is. But I would go back to the same thing where it's like, hey, we have to replace the HVAC. You know, and so you plan to, you budget a certain amount for maintenance, and then you take it out to bid like we have to, and it comes back higher. Or there's a change.
I so agree. I so agree. And I see one of the additional challenges there of any agency should not be over reserving. And so reserving for something like an HVAC unit, where we have this theory that we're putting money aside for an HVAC unit, and then it turns out we still don't have enough money for the HVAC unit. What was the point in putting any of that money there to begin with? And so over reserving is a risk of that kind of exercise as well. And through all of these potential policies, that's the crux. How specific do you get? And right now we have a broader policy on some of these things, or lacking it fully. How do you kind of get the right forage temperature on them
Right.
to make them useful?
I think what I would recommend with this is that we go back and try to create something that isn't overly that doesn't overly tie our hands to something that there's no way we can successfully stick to the policy. But there are things that I think that are good tools that we could use in doing capital budgeting, and to memorialize those and have those going forward, so future generations of employees that are going through that process are making sure they're ticking those boxes as they go. It's really putting in policy, again, a lot of the things that we've already started doing in public works and water and other areas within our CIP, and making sure that we continue that practice going forward after all those people are gone. I think this is kind of what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, I'll be honest, before I go, is to try to set a.
You seem very definitive on that, by the way.
I say for whatever that period is, you look at it, you're always looking at what your next thing is gonna be, right?
Yeah.
I'm a finance guy. I don't have a lot of legacies that are gonna come to me. Hey, you bought great pencils one day. You know, we don't have that, but this is. So this is like a thing that we could go in to make sure that we're laying the groundwork for good, transparent, appropriate budgeting going forward. So we could try to take a stab at that, and it may be that we get into here and with a policy like that and have a discussion about it and go, you know what, this just doesn't seem realistic. Let's go with the ones that are more realistic. But that would be my.
Okay, and then my last question is, how would this policy jive with our facilities investment report we did in 2019?
Yeah.
I won't be tactful. It likely wouldn't.
It wouldn't, yeah.
Okay.
And that comes back to. Well, I don't want to get into a long discussion about that study. But coming back to our last conversation around HVAC units.
Mhm.
Well, take the HVAC units and multiply them times, 200 million, right? How do we do that? I think there probably is a thoughtful way if we wanted to have that exercise of saying, how do you prioritize where we're catching up on deferred maintenance? That can be done in a more broad way, using that study to inform us of where the best return on investment is for deferred maintenance, right? Here's where we get bang for buck, whether that's HVAC units or et cetera. But again, how specific do we get?
Okay, thank you.
Ellen, I like the way that you underlined the trade-offs between setting these policies and the needs or the priorities of future councils. That's one of the most interesting parts to me. Just with where this conversation has gone in this very cursory foray into this topic, it seems obvious that we need to continue this discussion. I like the idea of at least having a serious examination of whether we need to have some kind of policies in these areas. That seems like a no-brainer. My sense, and I'll look to my colleagues to see if that there's agreement, is that this committee might be the would be the best next stop for that. If you want to take a crack at policies that might weigh the trade-offs of setting some goals, which we all share, but doing so in a way that future councils won't grit their teeth at us because of. And then coming back here and having that conversation, that seems like a very productive use of a meeting. And
No, and the four that I've mentioned here, are those fine with us coming back with those?
absolutely.
Then
And there is agreement from both of you?
Yeah.
Okay,
that's what we'll do.
perfect. Thank you for raising this and thank you for doing such a nice job of outlining where we can go with this and the benefits. And with that, I'll throw it open. We still have no public comment, right? Both of you. All right, now. All right. Well, then bringing it back. Hold on, I'm gonna pull up my agenda here. It's item 4.2. And Veronica, are you next? Are we talking forecast?
Yes.
Great. Move on to that.
So today, the presentation I'm bringing forward is just to give everyone a preliminary look at our fiscal year 25-26 budget and the forecast going forward. I know we've seen this forecast many times, but this is the first time that we have our next fiscal year budget numbers substantially complete enough that we feel we can share them. And I'll say it again, these are preliminary. We will bring this forecast and this budget back to council a few times more in the next few months, and these numbers will change a little bit. So substantially speaking, it's all here, but we're still in the works of refining our budget. So in fiscal year 25-26, we have a $19.3 million deficit. And this is a pretty sobering number to see, even for someone who's been at this for a few years and been working on this forecast for a few years too. In a nutshell, it's a two-factor situation. Our revenues are growing slow and our expenditures are skyrocketing. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to go into some detail on the assumptions and what's driving this deficit specifically. You go to the next slide, please. So just to jump in and look at some of the revenues for fiscal year 25-26, some of the major changes that we've seen. Back in November, we had a couple tax measures go out to the voters that passed, which was a great step. And we are very thankful to the public and to council for getting those through. And we're anticipating about $3 million extra in our general fund revenue coming in from those. Our property tax, which is a major driver in our general fund, continues to be strong, even though the housing market is not exactly booming. Home sale prices in Santa Rosa are still pretty high, and we're seeing everybody's property tax continue to grow. So we are expecting about a 5% growth rate of 3.6 million. And that's standard. That's what kind of our 3 to 5 year average is. Our sales tax, which we know has been a big topic with council over the last few years. We are reducing our budget estimate this year by $5.5 million. That is causing some pretty drastic effects on our revenue budget. So this is necessary to do. Our actuals and sales tax have not been meeting our budget over the course of a few years. The next slide, I'll show you a graph that will talk about that a little more. So this was a very necessary step. We recently had our long-range forecast evaluated by a third party. We had some consultants look at it to vet it, make sure everything looked good. And one of their top points that they came back with was you need to reduce your sales tax number. So that's what we're doing this year. A couple other major revenue sources in the general fund, not as significant as sales tax and property tax, but we pay close attention to nonetheless, our PED charges for services and our recreation charges for services. These have no net increase in 25-26. In PED, we had a fee study come through that took effect in July of 2024. But what we're seeing is a lot of projects were already in the pipeline under the old fee schedule. So as they take time to complete and they are now just going through building inspections or kind of these later phases, they are still grandfathered in under these old fees. So we haven't yet seen any growth. We've also seen a shift in the development field to smaller projects, remodels. It's not the booming development that we saw a few years ago. So while it's healthy and it's not a downturn, it's not exactly bringing in major revenues year over year, major increases. And in recreation, we did see some growth in some categories, such as our Finley Aquatic and Senior Center, but these have been offset by decreases due to budget reductions that we took action that was taken in January. So we reduced some recreation programs that had a net positive effect on the general fund. The expenditures we removed were definitely greater than the revenues, but there was a revenue piece that had to come out of the general fund for things like Howard Park concessions and our facilities rentals for the Church of One Tree and the Turktown Barn. So in total, we're looking at a year-over-year change in the general fund of $1.2 million for revenues. There were other increases and decreases in other smaller categories, but nothing significant. This is the bulk of it. And that equates to about 1%. So 1% revenue growth in the general fund is very dismal. And when you consider what our expenditures grow at, these are our resources that we use to pay for all of our operations, and it's just not there to support what we have going on the expenditure side. So next slide, please. A bit of a look back on sales tax. So this chart represents our Bradley Burns portion of sales tax, which comes from the state. We do also have a district tax of a 0.5-cent sales tax in Santa Rosa, but it follows roughly the same trend line. So this one, I'm just going to walk you through some of the years of what's been going on with sales tax. The green line is our budget number, and the blue line, the brighter line there, is our actuals. So starting back in 18-19, they were pretty close. Our actuals exceeded budget by just a bit. And as we moved into 19-20, we all remember what happened at the fourth quarter of that year. As the pandemic started to hit, spending dropped off. This was in March, April, May, June. So the very beginning of the pandemic, when everybody was terrified. And we started to see revenues go down. And it was also at that time of year, which is the same time of year that we were developing our budget for the next fiscal year. So we didn't quite have the foresight to see what was going to happen. Everybody was sure the economy was going to tank. So we majorly reduced our budget for 2021. We see that dip go down in the green line. But we all know what happened. It turned out everybody stayed home and spent their money and shopped and remodeled their homes. And so we saw our sales tax go way up. We corrected it in the next year in 2021. We brought our budget back up and it hit our actuals just about right there. We had a good year of matching our forecast to our actuals. But in 22-23, our actual line started to drop below our budget and we started to see that growth slow. So out of concern, we weren't quite sure. Our consultants were telling us at the time, oh, growth is slowing. It's not going to decrease. It's just slowing down. We held our budget flat. You can see that green line on top stay flat between 22-23 to 23-24, hoping that the actuals would start to increase and meet up where our budget was. But they didn't, they decreased. And that was a big surprise to us at the time. We did not expect them to go down. Our consultants were telling us they may stay flat or just grow slowly. So that was very eye-opening. In 24-25, we continued to hold our budget flat, thinking this is the year it's going to start to rebound. This is the year it'll make a comeback. But what we're projecting is that they're going to come in at about the same place they did last year. We're going to miss our mark on our budget by $5 million. So for next fiscal year, it's imperative that we bring that line down. This is not a good budget number that we're keeping. Our consultants, we met with them last month regarding sales tax and the economy, and they are very conservative, or they have very conservative estimates. With the talk on tariffs and inflation, consumer spending is not as hopeful as we would like it to be. They actually project negative growth in the next 2 years, decreases of about 1%. This is pretty catastrophic to our general fund. Sales tax is our #1 revenue source, so we would hope it would at least grow with a normal pace of expenditure growth, but instead it's going negative, essentially. So we're going to be doing a large reduction of our budget in fiscal year 25-26. We're hoping that in the future years, it's not going to be, if we do need to reduce our budget, it won't be quite that much going forward, but it certainly isn't going to be bouncing back in the next 2 years. So next slide, please. So that concludes the talk about what's going on with revenues. I'm going to shift over to expenditures now, because this is, as I mentioned, kind of a two main drivers. Both the revenues and the expenditures are not moving in the directions we want. So in the general fund, we're about 75 to 77% salaries and benefits. And in fiscal year 25-26 alone, we're seeing $9.3 million of increases due to salaries and benefits. So this is a combination of cost of living increases that were written into our labor agreements. There was an equity adjustment for all miscellaneous employees that has been written in as well. Incentive pays for public safety, as well as uncontrollable increases in benefit costs. So that's accounting for $9.3 million. So back in January, council took action to reduce our operational costs in the general fund by 4.1 million. I'm sorry, there's a typo in the writing. It should say 4.1, it says 4.0. We reduced our operating expenditures by 4.1 million. So this has a favorable effect on our outlook and on our forecast and our budget for fiscal year 25-26. So that was good to see our expenditures go down by that much. We were able to remove people and operational costs from our budget for 25-26. We also had a windfall of about 1.3 million in our budget with the passing of Measure H for fire. We now have our Redcom contract being paid for by an outside party, or by not an outside party, but I believe it's through the county. But we have a savings of about 1.3 million of professional services that we used to budget for that we no longer need to pay for out of our general fund. However, we did see sharp increases in our fleet costs, as well as our fire and earthquake insurance. So that immediately absorbed that decrease. So those were the big things that happened in the general fund. Again, there were other minor increases and decreases. We have been really working with departments to hold things flat where we can and decrease. And it's pretty painful to do because almost everything grows year over year, contracts and professional services, but we are trying our best to cut where we can in any offsetting categories. But in the net total, at the high level speaking, we're looking at about a $5.7 million increase in expenditures in the general fund. And next slide. And some of the future assumptions that when we looked at that first slide of the forecast that grows our deficit up to $45 million, some of the things feeding that deficit are mostly salaries and benefits. We do have a 4% COLA for all miscellaneous employees for fiscal year 26-27, as well as we assume 1% for any merit increases or step increases that would come. And then we're assuming 3% growth in salaries thereafter. We're not sure what negotiations will bring. We're just putting something in to try to be reasonable of what we think might happen. Our UAL, which is our CalPERS unfunded liability, that alone grows by $11 million over the next 5 years. This is per our CalPERS valuation report. So when we see a deficit going from 19 million to 46 million, that's $25 million. 11 of that is our UAL. Completely uncontrollable. In our services and supplies, we are growing most categories at 1% or even holding them flat. We know that's not realistic. We're just assuming that departments will need to conserve and spend less as time goes on as we see these costs grow. Some uncontrollable costs, though, are fire and earthquake insurance grows at about 15% year to year. That's based on historical trends. And our vehicle replacement and repair is growing at about 7% based on historical trends. Also, we have new clean energy mandates that have come down that our fleet that we purchase needs to now be clean. A certain percentage of them need to be clean energy vehicles, which is more expensive to repair, to replace, et cetera. It's just feeding costs. And next slide, please. So when we put everything together to show how we got from our current year deficit of 13.3 million to 19.3 million, we look at our additional revenue that we talked about on slide 3 of about 1.2 million and our additional expenditures of 5.7 million. And we add that to what were our existing operations. And then the other piece that always gets lost that is a little confusing to talk about are transfers in and out. This isn't necessarily expenditures and revenues, but it's movement of funds from the general fund to other funds in and out. And on a net basis, all things considered, our transfers out are increasing by 1.5 million in 25-26. And that is due to our ARPA funds expiring. And now the general fund is once more picking up the cost of homeless services. So ARPA had been covering it through part of last year. So we're seeing that increase, which brings us to our budgeted deficit of 19.3 million in 25-26. And so looking at that forecast in the next 5 years, our budget development this year has taken on kind of a different tone. You have heard us talk about the structural deficit in the general fund many times. We've been trying to bring in more revenue. We've been trying to cut expenditures. Council's been doing everything right. But we are finding ourselves kind of at the brink of this cliff. We're there now. We're in the midst of it. We saw it coming and it's coming a lot faster, I think, than we anticipated and at a greater speed. So we are this week and next week, meeting with the city manager, department by department, going through budgets. Departments are bringing forward reduction lists, proposed reductions for her to evaluate, which we will bring to council. I guess we can go to the next slide. This goes into the next topic. On April 15th, we'll be coming to council for a study session with budget reductions proposed by the departments for council to evaluate and offer feedback on. We will then incorporate those recommended by council into our budget and come back again on May 6th and 7th for the in-depth study session of our budget. And that will kind of give our total effect of once we implement those budget reductions that council agrees to, what our deficit looks like at that point. We'll also be back here at the LTFPA on April 22nd to give you our third quarter results in the general fund. And at that point, we should be able to project to see where we're going to land the year in the general fund, so we can get a taste of what our reserves may be by year end. And that concludes the presentation. I'm happy to take any
All
questions.
right, bringing it back to my colleagues. Questions?
Just thoroughly depressed, but I have no question. It's really clear. Thank you. It's a really good report. It's just depressing.
Mr. O'Crookie?
Yeah, so sorry, I had to step out of the room real quick, but back to the transfers in of 2.3, what is that number?
So transfers in, that mostly comes from, we get gas tax from the state that we put towards our roads and streets, but we are allowed to take some of it for administrative costs. So that's primarily some of those admin costs from gas tax that we transfer into the general fund, and it just remains flat every year. We don't
Do we-
increase those.
Do we believe over the next 5 years that gas tax will stay at that level?
We can look at increasing that. That's something we've talked about before, but haven't really felt the need to do so because it takes it out of our CIP fund and.
I was thinking it was gonna go the other way.
Oh, reduce it.
Yeah, with
Okay.
less gas being bought.
As gas, well, that's true too. We have actually, gas tax, we were hearing it was going to go down, but we haven't quite seen it yet. So
Okay.
if and when it does start to decrease, that's something that, yes, we will. talk about.
So that's absolutely true. The reason really, the driver of the stability is that in reality, most of our special revenue funds have a fixed amount that the general fund recoups as administration, typically around 250 grand. So regardless of activity, it just kind of stays there.
Okay, and then with the where was it? Recreation charges for services. If we had projects that were fully funded at this point, that we could get out there that could provide more revenue streams, I mean, that would, I know this sounds like a stupid question, but that would be beneficial, wouldn't it?
It was fully funded.
Well, I think there needs to be a recognition that I've done this and we've done this in the past. While certainly our recreation programs bring in revenue, if they are practically all loss leaders, that's where the math gets hard. Does that make sense? So if
We're losing money, but we can make it up in volume. Is that the old canard?
Yeah, I think where we've been challenged in the past when we do those types of analysis of launching new programs that are revenue backed, if it costs us $1 to bring in 90 cents worth of revenue,
What I'm
and it's a new program.
I appreciate it. What I'm getting at is if we are restricted for using some of our parks during certain months, but then we can go to using them year round, that would be beneficial, would it not?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah, bringing more utilization to existing assets to bring in more revenue. Absolutely.
okay. And then how much money have we gotten from the county from Measure O?
You know, we just got 1.4 million in yesterday, I think, but I'm not sure on a cumulative basis.
Yeah, I don't have the exact amount for you. What I could say is that I know that we're having ongoing discussions with them in a way to fund in response, which definitely helps, especially on the near term. I would love to be able to get into a long-term agreement with that, to be able to know for sure that that's paid for over the long term. But at this point, we'll take anything we can get. Your point's well taken. I mean, I think that's part of the discussions that have been going on between the city and the county, is to get more of those funds here to be able to support a program like in response.
Yeah, what I was trying to get at in a more delicate manner was while we can take everything, we would gladly take whatever we can get. It's not necessarily as was advertised. I can be indelicate about that.
I think you already have. We've crossed the line.
So, yeah, that's one concern I have. Sorry, I had some notes here. So when going back and look at, we talk about COVID shutdown and the dollar staying here. Can you go into a little bit of a little bit more of a detail about how that affects us now versus the year prior and the year since versus the years during the shutdown when people are at home, and then online sales, what we get from online sales versus not?
Sales tax, so I may need help with the online sales portion. It's a very complicated equation that we've asked our consultants about quite a bit. But we have seen more of a shift to online sales. What we're seeing is consumers are spending more of their services locally and their goods online. We've also seen in the last year or two, consumers spending more of their discretionary income on things like travel and things they couldn't spend it on during the pandemic. So that's also taking money out of our sales tax. We've also seen with interest rates and inflation being high, there's less to spend. So it's been kind of a multi-factor situation of less dollars going into the local economy, into the brick and mortar. I don't know if you have anything to add about the online factor.
Well, we hear a lot, and I think that it's starting to bear out definitely in our numbers, is that the sales tax system itself is kind of broken. And COVID definitely amplifies that. So a lot of things changed with COVID, and moving forward, I think it's going to do a number not only on economists, but on just in general on how businesses function, how cities get revenue, all of that stuff. It's kind of amazing to see just one thing in our lifetime that basically turned all stuff that we knew sort of on its head. But to more specifically answer your question, what we saw is more people started buying online, and that trend continued. The good news is that we are able to get sales tax through online purchases, as the Wayfair decision that happened a number of years ago. And if that hadn't happened, we would have been completely hosed during COVID. You would have seen the actuals probably match what our budget was at that point. But because of that decision, we were able to get sales tax revenue in. But what we are starting to see now is that there are a lot of purchases that go through Amazon, and those revenues go to fulfillment centers, and there have been changes in how sales tax is allocated to where county pools start getting less, cities start getting less out of that. And if your city or jurisdiction has a fulfillment center in it, you're doing great right now because they're keeping those dollars. So we're now seeing a little bit less than what we would get. So we're seeing a change in trend or behavior of shoppers. They're not going to brick and mortar as much. They're buying things online. They're buying a lot of stuff online from Amazon, and it's that type of revenue that we're seeing that we're going to need to adjust to. And I think it's part of our adjustments that we're making now that are coming in for us. Also, the shift from buying goods versus buying or spending money on services. So people are spending money on areas that we can't get sales tax from. And so you combine all of that stuff, you into where what we're thinking that we're seeing is a new normal of a lower sales tax amount that's coming to us. So a lower base amount that's coming to us. And that's probably gonna be what we're gonna see for the foreseeable future. And probably I wouldn't, I don't know how much growth that we're gonna be able to forecast over that. I mean, every time we end quarterly, we are either doing California consensus reports from one of there are two big sales tax consultants in California. And we monitor both of them. One of them is ours and the other one isn't, but we monitor it where we can go to those webinars and they're all saying the same thing. And so, you know, we're trying to be very sensitive of any tick down in sales tax means a major hit to our general fund. So we don't want to overreact, but we've so far underreacted. And that was also called out at goal setting, and it's part of the report that we got back. And yeah, it was time for us to make that change. But I think that is what you're seeing from that point moving forward. You know, the way that we look at sales tax kind of changed, and that's what we need to adjust to in the future.
Okay, and then I'm not a CPA, but I do believe 4.1 million does not equal 19.3 million.
Right.
So we have more cuts coming. I mean,
yeah.
How much can we reasonably expect to have to cut to get to a point where we're not getting to as basically broke? And in what time period?
So that's part of the analyses that we're doing and that we're working with. And we have to measure a number of things, right? How much can the organization actually withstand in cuts? What I will say is this, it's more than 4.1 million. We need to focus on ongoing deficit reduction. And you can see how much it snowballs year over year. Those are the things that we have to do. So you will be seeing a number like that, I would guess in April. I'm not prepared to discuss that right now, but that is your point is extremely well taken. And it's what we're working on to try to guide the council and the city manager through this process.
Yeah, I just want kind of final comment. Is that fine?
Go for it.
All right. Yeah, I mean, I jotted down some of the words that were used: dismal, catastrophic, imperative reductions. So I think for me, my biggest concern right now is not to throw anyone's employer under the bus, but I don't want to be like local higher education institutions or
That's kind of throwing them under the bus.
I don't want to. I said I didn't want to. I didn't say I wasn't. But I don't want to cut 25 million over a 1 month period. So what I'm trying to get at is how do we make, are we going to be able to make rational, safe cuts over an extended period of time so that we don't start bouncing payroll checks?
That is what that's absolutely our intent. Because that example that you gave is one that, you know, when I say what the organization can withstand, it's that focus that we have. Now, we know that we have to be cognizant of how much runway we have, and I could say we don't have a lot. we, you know, we just don't have a lot. So, you know, we're probably in the line of more of an ongoing budget development. I don't think it ends in April or June. It continues to go on. So you're going to see us chipping away at this. You know, also cognizant of, we don't want to, you know, go through death by 1,000 cuts. No pun intended, but, you know, that type of thing. So there's a lot of stuff that we're weighing. And, you know, the first step is, you know, we actually took it in January. Now, granted, it didn't help very much, but it's the step. And the next step is where we're going now, and with a renewed focus on ongoing focus on reducing the deficit to be able to preserve our reserves, to, you know, try to keep some sort of a runway and to go from there. But that's, you know, I think everything that you're saying is stuff that we've had that discussion already internally, and that's the focus as we move through.
Yeah, just one clarification for the PB. There will be no bouncing of payroll checks, and there will be no death by 1,000 cuts. Alina, you can cross those lines out. Mr. Krepke.
I was using it as an example, not as an inevitability. Yeah, I just think that one thing that my one recommendation going forward from a 20,000 foot overview is that I think that this situation needs to be made crystal clear in April, May, June adoption, and going forward to not just us three, but the entirety of the body of city council, to stakeholders, to the general public, that this is not like, oh, we're trying to figure things out and we'll make some cuts here and we'll be, but crystal clear about, if we don't do anything, if we don't do what, you know, we need to do, where it leads.
I would say that, and absolutely in April, we'll have that, and we've started that part of the presentation on how we can show that. I would say, you know, just in really broad numbers, that you're probably looking, you know, around, you know, $10-ish million this year, maybe $13-14 million next year. That's of ongoing. So that's the level that we're talking about.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep.
And I think,
Oh, sorry,
Oh,
Scott,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
and those are the numbers really evident within the slides Veronica painted, and that is the picture.
It's been Willis.
I just wanted to, kind of along the lines of what Jeff is saying, it's not really a question, but really just a comment about, thinking about the entire council and how we look at this, you know, and the school comparison is a good one. Unfortunately, that we know we need to make cuts. It's just a question of how do we do that and stay solvent, of course, but also the stress that will happen to the employees, not just the employees that go, but the employees that stay, and having additional work and all of that, and still being able to provide services. And I think that's, for me, it's going to be about trying to balance all of that, let alone the numbers. So I think that's, that's.
All right, well, let me try to turn this a little bit. I'll start with, I'll start with a note of thanks. So you guys have had a tough job of running these numbers for the last, at this point, we're going on 18 months, something like that, of like a very concerted effort to try to get a sense of what was coming our way. And we've been able to, it's been palpable how the rhythm of that has picked up in recent months, which is exactly how it should be. So the fact that we have these meetings already laid out, we're having this blunt discussion today, which is just the latest in a series of blunt discussion. And Alan, as you described it, we're no longer in once or twice a year, some kind of budget study session. This is going to be a recurring topic for council and for this subcommittee for years to come. Which is exactly how it should be. And thank you for managing that. That's a big load for you guys. But you've done a nice job in making sure the council's informed and prepared. I wouldn't say that this is a hopeful context. In fact, it's not hopeful at all, but I think it's worth us noting, especially us on council level, but certainly city staff as well, that we're not the only organization locally going through this. Almost every company I talk to is having the same kind of discussion and usually at the same level. So when we're thinking about the community, they're not going to be surprised by this, but they're going to be glad that we're having the same serious conversation that they're going through at their employer across the city. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily do great things for our future city revenues if we're looking at people going through the same kind of situation across the board. But we're part of a larger community having this discussion right now. Let me grasp at a few straws. Some of them were ones that Jeff was grasping at a moment ago. Just so I have figures straight in my head. With the business tax and TOT, our original estimates were that those might bring in somewhere closer to 4.5 to 5 million a year combined. Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, I would say, I think if you're looking at 3 to 5 million,
Okay.
I don't think it's more than 5.
Right.
3 was, considering they were just
So we're only getting this, yeah, it's a few months.
that's something that will hopefully adjust up a little bit. But I can't imagine that it would be any more than 5.
I'm grasping at straws at this point. I wanted to know if there was maybe another million or two there in the future.
The couch cushions?
Yeah, exactly. And then likewise, the PED charges for services. On the back of the envelope math that we were doing during council, that might be another 2 million a year, something like that, as we go forward. Once the new projects are in the pipeline and we're getting more reimbursements back from those charges, that gets us a couple million a year, right?
Yeah, so it's possible, but I would caution this, you know, the word recession is starting to get thrown around quite a bit.
Yeah.
And you know, so some of that stuff in the pipeline may not be in the pipeline. Some of the permits that get pulled now may not be pulled. So
I'm thinking longer
Yeah.
term, not necessarily in the next year, but as we look out, especially over that 5-year forecasting,
Yeah.
there should be additional money coming in through that channel because of the changes in the fees.
Right, and I'm not saying that there wouldn't be additional money. If you want to put a $2 million number on that, you can.
I'm not writing it down.
What
It's in the
I'm
back of
gonna,
my head.
yeah, I would, if you wrote it down, I would write it down with an eraser.
Eraser.
Um,
I'm looking for areas
I
where
hope
we
so.
can maybe can get a little of this back. 'Cause it's
what
all
I
about
would
how-
say is I hope so. But with everything that is your future looking on things that are fee driven like that, I would just be wary. And a note of caution is all I'm saying.
That caveat clearly noted.
I may take the bait here.
To the upside, are you gonna paint more
Agreed.
positive?
I will be slightly even more sobering. Fundamentally, I hear that we have some opportunities coming here in fees. Let's understand that the problem that we're in is expenditure based
Yes.
primarily.
I hear.
Secondarily, sales tax is the whale in the ocean.
Yep.
And certainly these little fish on the side are valid, but yes, I hear you. It's just, I want to be sober towards that laser focus towards our big bubble.
Give me my few moments.
You got it.
Understood.
Yes, Mayor.
All right, back to bigger fish, medium-sized fish at least. And Jeff actually hit the nail on the head. So the two legitimately sizable revenue opportunities for the city, if I'm understanding it, it's Measure O funds from the county. And then there Measure M funds would help us as well, correct?
Yeah.
Measure M,
Mhm.
because right now, and this is for the general public who are watching, and again, if we have any Press Democrat representatives online, Right now, our homelessness services are being covered by the general fund, as are almost all of our parks, parks costs. So the voters have passed the Measure O and Measure M ordinances. Those could both return a sizable up to 8 figures in revenues back to the city, that would be a legitimate chunk out of our budget deficit, while still, Scott, to your point, being clear that we have to have an adjustment on the expenditure side, not forgetting that. But I do think that Councilmember Kripke was correct to highlight the Measure O, or to highlight how a better county partnership could take a sizable chunk or sizable bite out of the situation that we're in. So I'm glad that you highlighted that.
You're much more delicate than
Yes,
I.
say that with love. On the expenditure side, I think clearly there's gonna be more information coming on April 15th. We don't need to belabor that point right now. We all know what's coming. Again, unfortunately, too many organizations are having that discussion. I want to keep it in that context because to your point about how we need to be, well, this is really falls on us doing the community engagement work. When we're out talking to those other organizations, needing to be sensitive to the fact that what we're going through, so many other people are going through right now. So just keeping that in mind as we go public with this information, but I completely agree that this needs to be very clearly and publicly discussed over the months to come, so we're not catching anybody off guard. I think that was it for me. That was the most I could spin this. It's a sobering report. And with that, we still have no one from the public. So I think we conclude that item. And I'm going back to my agenda here, but is it potential items for future meetings? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
All right, so throwing it open to the floor. I think we see clearly what our main items are for the future. Is there anything we need to add to future items? I'll turn to council first.
I don't want to add anything else.
I don't want to add anything either. How about
This should be our sole focus, honestly.
Caroline, how about you?
I would love to know, I know we talked to city manager about those discussions with the county,
Yeah,
but I don't know how we get informed about where that is and if there's anywhere that the council can help with that. Because, so here's my thing. The county has what is called human services, right? They provide services for homeless folks, for example. And some cities within the state of California do have a human services department. We don't.
right.
And yet we're trying
Not
to
officially.
provide homeless services. Why? Because our constituents see that homelessness is within the city, so they expect us to do that. But the thing is, we don't have a real mechanism for it except for the general fund. So I just feel like I don't know if it's us, but we need to find out how we can have a better relationship with the county. I know that's the first and the foremost, but also how we can have a real partnership with them so that it doesn't all fall on us, because we really should be doing this together. So I don't know, that to me, that's, I guess I would like to know maybe in the future where those discussions are and if there's anything that we can do as a council to help those discussions along. That's,
Let me take a crack at that. This will be a
Okay.
question, if a friendly rider to your question.
Mhm.
So there is the ongoing project right now to be clear about how much we're spending on particular programs within the city. Correct? We discussed this at goal setting.
Mhm.
Homelessness is top among them. To have a really clear, we got a pretty good sense of how much we're spending on all our homelessness programs combined. But is my understanding correct? They're really trying to dial that in even further in terms of what the city's true expenditure is across the board.
Yes.
So that's a project that's already underway. To your question, since that's really the biggest issue here. If at some point in the convenient future, knowing that you've got a ton on your desk right now, but given that project's already underway within your office, if that information could be presented to this group to say that our current, based on the analysis that we've undertaken, here are the costs for homelessness services in particular, so that we had a clear understanding at this level, and then at the council level, as we're doing the advocacy with the county, and having a way to very clearly articulate what the city costs are, more than the kind of the hand waving that we have been doing today. How much anxiety. I'm looking at your eyes to see what kinds of anxiety I'm causing you right now. How does that, and does this get to your question? Does
Yeah,
that get?
it does.
That sounds
it
like a
does,
post-May thing.
Okay, yes.
So, yeah, the anxiety was just trying to figure out which meeting this would go on, but I would think, well, April is gonna be our third quarter update, and I think that should be probably the focus of that meeting. I think by May, we could probably have that here to at least have some sort of a discussion with it. And, you know, I know the city manager has met with the county administrator. There's those things that are happening.
And I'll add that she and I met with the county administrator and the board chair recently where this was discussed. So there are some very direct discussions. Having a harder, firmer numbers on our side is gonna be necessary.
Yeah.
Sooner or later. Now, again, this is not the only thing that's on your desk. So the timeline you're describing sounds good to me, but it's obviously of interest to the full council.
Well, I think it's gonna be something that would be important as part of, you know, it's just part of the overall budget discussion that we're having, where all of our programs and all of our operations are looked at through that lens of what is the actual cost of doing that service. So, but I think May is a reasonable period to be able to get back here with something. If it's, I can't commit to April.
You have enough on your plate, unless I have objections from my colleagues. We're not,
May is good.
we're not looking to add to the stress level. We're
Yeah.
looking to take advantage of work that's already underway that could yield additional revenues for the city if we can push some of these discussions along with the county. That's the goal.
Perfect.
I certainly have nothing to add. I agree. We know what our marching orders are. Anything for us? From your side? Are there other wide-ranging
I think we've
conversations that you
given
guys
that
want to have?
I mean,
What about a
pretty much the three horsemen of the apocalypse whenever we're.
All right, with that, again, I don't have my agenda in front of me. Have we moved to adjournment? Thanks to everyone. Again,
Yes,
a
thank
really substantive presentation today. And necessary.
Thank you.
Good stuff.